I'd like to share with you this morning from the book of Ruth. And I'm going to focus on chapter 2. But I'll just tell you a little bit of the background, and the title of my message this morning is Extraordinary Kindness. Extraordinary Kindness. The book of Ruth is set in the days of the Judges. It was a chaotic time in the history of Israel. There was no king. And every time the leader that God appointed died, the people did their own thing. They did what was right in their own eyes. Unlike the church today, we're all focused on the Lord and we always do what He wants us to do. Of nie. In many ways, it's similar. In many ways, it's similar to the period we're living in today. And therefore, it was a time of spiritual, social, and political turmoil in Israel's history. And then, to make matters worse, there was a famine that struck the land. And the book of Ruth starts with the story of hoe sê jy sy naam in Engels? Elimelech. In Holland, I've got to always learn to say the words they speak in Dutch. So there it's Elimelech. Hoe sê die Afrikaners dit? Elimelech. Anyway, that man, he had a wife called Naomi, which is easier to say, of course, and along with their 2 sons, they left the land of Judah to go. They were living in Bethlehem. They left that land to go to Moab in order to escape the famine that was there in their land. But their immigration to Moab does not turn out well. Elimelech dies in Moab. The sons, Machlon and Chilion, they married 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And after 10 years, after the death of their father, 10 years later, both the sons also die. Those sons have no children, and therefore there are 3 widows left. 3 widows. And they are penniless and are left without a protector, which was in those days very important. The future looked very bleak for Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. Widows in those times were often ignored and even abused, and they were usually poor and destitute. But then at a certain point in time, Naomi hears that in the land where she comes from, in Judah, the famine is over, and she decides to return to Bethlehem. And she thought it would be better for her 2 daughters-in-law, who were Moabitesses, to stay in Moab. But they want to go with their mother. And then we have the famous words of Ruth, one of her 2 daughters-in-law, that says to Naomi, "Please don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you, Naomi, and me, Ruth." And so the 2 women decide to go to Moab together. They leave to Bethlehem. They leave Moab and go to Bethlehem in Judah. And they arrived there as the barley harvest was beginning. And that was a time that the community expressed their joy and praise to God for His goodness, because it was the beginning of spring. It was a time of new life and new beginnings. And Naomi, when she arrived there, said to the people that they should not call her Naomi, which means pleasant one, but that they should call her Mara, which means bitter one. So the people recognized her. She's been gone for many years. The people recognized her and say, oh, that must be Naomi. Isn't that Naomi? Oh, it is Naomi. And then she says, don't call me Naomi. I'm no longer the pleasant one. I am bitter. The embittered Naomi, who is imprisoned by selfishness now, blames God for her sorrow and poverty. You can read those things in chapter 1. And now we pick up the story in chapter 2, verse 2. Verse 1 tells us who Boaz was in relation to Naomi, but she didn't know it at that time, so I'm going to read it from the point that what they knew. They didn't know yet about Boaz there. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And Naomi said to her, go, my daughter. So Ruth set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer, die voorman, replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. And she asked us this morning, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. And she came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you, Ruth, have come to take refuge. She says, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. I already said that Ruth is a widow, and she's a foreigner. And it was almost impossible for such people, foreigner and then being a widow, to support herself. Such needy people, however, were allowed to gather grain on the edges of the field. God had told Israel to do the same, or to do that. He had told them that's how you can look after the widows and the orphans and the poor. And this morning, this particular morning, Ruth says to her mother-in-law, not in these words, but she expresses her trust in the God whom she's gotten to know because of Ruth. And she says to the mother, let me go and see what I can find to gather grain. In our difficult situation, let me trust God to provide for you and me. And in that trusting, she says, let me trust God. I'm trusting God to bring me to the land of a farmer who will show kindness to me. This is a completely different attitude to the embittered Naomi. And Naomi says, go. So she ends up on a piece of land that is owned by a man named Boaz. And sometime later, while she's busy there, the landowner Boaz comes to the place where Ruth was. The Bible tells us that Boaz was a wealthy man, a man of standing in the society, and he was a very kind and a generous man. And what do we learn about Boaz here? We see that he had hardly greeted his workers, all those on the field, when he noticed a stranger on his land. The man is very observant. He is very alert to people. And he sees this woman who he does not know. And he asks his foreman, he says, who is that young lady over there? And the foreman says to him, she is the young woman from Moab. She is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And she asked us if she can come here and gather grain behind the harvesters, which was allowed to be done at that time. And we said yes, and as she started, she's been hard at work. So that was noticed by the people, that she was a hard worker. And then what happens is that Boaz offers her a safe work environment. I told you already, women like that were very vulnerable, and they could easily be abused. The men, for instance, could make remarks, they could be nasty, or they could try and take advantage of such a woman. But Boaz, he wants to create for her a very safe working environment. And so he warns his young men, you do not treat her roughly. You do not touch her. And then he says they mustn't give her a hard time, nor must they stop her. The generous Boaz does far more than may be expected of him. He goes the second mile. Because he could have said, yes, you're allowed to continue working here. But he could have kept his mouth about what he possibly knew happened in such circumstances, that men misused women like that. But he goes the second mile and he says, no, don't touch her. And now we see in Boaz that he desires to be an instrument in the hand of God. And he invites Ruth to drink water from the jars the men have filled. That is an extra blessing. So you don't have to, Ruth, go and find your own water, but my men, they fill those jars of water, and you can go and use that water. And then he comes along and he says, when it's lunchtime, Ruth, come along and eat with us. And by doing so, he gives her hope and offers her perspective in life. All she wants to do is to care for her mother-in-law and herself. And just feeding themselves, that was enough in her thinking. But here comes Boaz, and he gives her hope that is bigger than that, and he gives her perspective in life. Oh, there is possibly a greater future for us. And what Boaz does is that he uses his wealth to show love. And in doing so, he wants to show the love and the compassion and the grace of God to people around him. And he uses his privileged position of power not for personal gain, as so often people in power do, but no, he uses it for all kinds of kind acts of benevolence, of kindness to others. And so he insists, he says to her, stay in my fields. Stay close to the women who are working and harvesting. And then he says to them that they must drop some extra for her to be able to pick up. So not only the edges of the field, the farmland, but that they must also give some extra. And then he says to the young men that they must let her glean even among the sheaves, and they must not tell her to stop. And they must pull out some extra stalks from their bundles so that she can pick up those things. Here we see a very generous, gracious, rich man wanting to care for those who do not have. And so he does everything what he can in order to be a blessing for Ruth and Naomi. And Boaz desires for Ruth to experience the grace and the goodness of God. He wants God to compensate Ruth and Naomi, but Ruth especially, for her loyalty and kindness towards her mother-in-law. His desire is that she will experience the wholeness, the contentment, and the peace that comes from knowing God. And so what we see in the story is that this kind Boaz has this vulnerable woman's best interest at heart. He's thinking about her and not about himself. He's thinking how he can be a blessing to her. He's thinking how he can create a safe work environment for her. He's thinking how she can be protected and feel safe within this new community she has come in. Ruth, on the other hand, is overwhelmed by his kindness. And she asks Boaz, "Why are you so kind to me? I'm a stranger, I'm a foreigner. I'm a widow, I don't deserve this. Ek is 'n buitelander." But he tells her that he has heard about her lot in life. Or he's told her that he's heard a lot about her, and that what he's heard is that she came back with Naomi and that she's taken care of her mother-in-law. And how she has left her parents back in Moab, which is quite a big step. And how she has now come to Naomi's people and has to make a lot of adjustments in a new culture, in a new setting. And we can read the story and we can say, what a coincidence that she lands there where Boaz is, because we learn from the story that Boaz was part of the family of Elimelech and he was the kinsman redeemer. So he had a certain responsibility to take upon himself the responsibility of looking after Naomi and those who belong to her. But it wasn't coincidence. The encounter between Ruth and Boaz is not an accident. Is nie 'n toeval of per toeval nie. That particular morning she goes in search of someone who will be gracious to her, someone who will be favorable to her, show her favor and kindness. And she takes a step of faith and seeks refuge under the wings of the God of Israel, because that's what he eventually says to her. You've sought your refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. So she takes a step of faith. She's come to know the God of her mother-in-law, because Moabites didn't serve the living God, but she came to know the Lord through her mother-in-law. And now she trusts that God and seeks his help. No, it is not a coincidence. It is the work of a loving and a generous God expressing his concern and care. And I don't know what your circumstances may be. And perhaps you are hoping for a coincidence, just to happen to meet the right person who can help you in your situation. But behind the scenes is a sovereign God who is at work. Romans 8 verse 28 says that God causes all things to work together for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. And to us sometimes it seems coincidences, and we've had those in our own lives. In my personal life, in our marriage, in our situation, in what God has called us to do. But it's because the hand of God is at work behind the scenes. And it was the sovereign Lord in whom Ruth had put her faith who led her to the field of Boaz. And then he led Boaz to go to the field on the day that Ruth was in that field. Because God knew. And God had heard the heart or seen the heart of Ruth. And so God works in amazing ways to bring people together. Because God is concerned about Ruth, and He's concerned about you in your situation too. Trust Him. But what we see here is that Ruth sets or takes the first step of faith. We need to take those steps of faith in obedience to what God says and trust Him for the rest. And so here we see the work of a gracious and loving God expressing His care and concern. We cannot control the circumstances of life, but we can control how we respond to them. We cannot control the circumstances of life, but we can control how we respond to those circumstances. And I think often we as Christians fail in our responses. We become angry at God. We become angry at people. We begin to talk about and rebel and whatever. But we can't change those circumstances generally. But what we can do something about is how we respond, how we react, and allow God to work those things out in our lives. And what we see in this story and it's not just a story, it's a true account of what happened, but what we see in this account is that God can produce wonderful things even out of tragedies. In impossible situations, God still uses people to help others and to bless others. And we've benefited from that, how we've seen that God has used people. We needed, when we went to Holland, in order for me to get Debbie with me, because I, in the meantime, got a Dutch passport, we needed a home and I needed a job. We knew nobody there. And God provided a job in a miraculous way, and then we needed a home, and it's very awkward system, very difficult. I can't explain it all at the time now. But you can't just go and say, I want to rent a house, because there aren't many private people renting houses. And then if you go onto the list of homes that are available through municipalities and that, you've got a long waiting list. And so it seemed impossible. Even the man that was giving me the job said, I don't know how long it's going to take to find a home. But we couldn't leave South Africa until we had that. And then there was a man who heard of us. He didn't know us, but he heard our story in that short while that I was looking over there for work and a house. And he was a Christian man. And he said, I've heard your story, and I felt that God say from the Old Testament to look after the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. And so I've bought a house so that you can rent it from us. And that's how we were able to get into Holland. And so we didn't know these people, neither the man who employed me nor the man who bought the house. But we took a step of faith. We heard God. We went to look how we can then get into the country to do what God has called us to do. And God worked in the hearts of other people. In impossible situations, God still uses people to help and bless others. And it may be that this morning, as I say this, you're sitting there and saying, oh God, will you bring that person across my path who is able to help me? And it may be a genuine need that you have, and it's not wrong to pray that. But I also want to say to you, why don't you ask God and say, God, in whose life do you want to use me to be a Boaz? I make myself available to you to be a Boaz in the life of Ruth somewhere. God used Boaz as a channel of His love, of His mercy, of His grace to care for Ruth. And God used Ruth to minister to and encourage and be a blessing to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And God used Naomi to care for Obed, because as we read on the book of Naomi, later Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son, and he's called Obed. And now Naomi is granny. And so she becomes no longer the embittered, self-centered person, but now she takes Obed into arms en sy pas hom op. Sy help. Sy is tot seën van die gesin. God uses people who trust and obey Him to change the situation or to change a situation from defeat to victory. God takes a mess and He brings forth something beautiful. God takes dust and He creates man. God speaks a word, out of nothing He creates the universe. And most times in the Bible we see that God uses people who are available to Him to be used. And God used these circumstances here. And Ruth doesn't know it, Naomi doesn't know it, Boaz doesn't know it. But God uses this event to prepare for the birth of the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. Long before, because place yourselves in this situation. Many, many people over hundreds of years heard that there was a Messiah coming, that He would be the Redeemer of Israel and all that. And when He came, they believed the promise, but they didn't recognize, because it wasn't like they thought it would happen. And so don't think in your situation, it must happen this way, it will happen that way. This is how it happened to Marius and Hanti, so it will happen in my life like that. Or this is how it happened to Francois and Debbie, so this is how it's going to happen in my life. No, God has many ways of working. Leave that to Him. You put your trust in Him and take the steps of faith and obedience that He requires of you. Even if you don't understand it all, because none of us do. And so I said, Boaz does far more than was expected of him, but we see Ruth gets far more than she could ever have dreamed of. All day long, she's laboring there with a happy and a hopeful heart, because she's met a man who is kind to her. He doesn't say, who do you think you are? He doesn't say, well, you're a foreigner, so I'll allow everybody to abuse you. No, she's experiencing the kindness and the grace of God through a man called Boaz. And so she works with a happy and a hopeful heart. She didn't have to worry about workers harassing her or hindering her. She had food when she was hungry. She had water when she was thirsty. She had a place of rest when she became weary. She gleaned enough food for her mother and her mother-in-law for nearly a week. And sometime later, Boaz marries her. Do you think that Ruth thought of any of those things when she left home that morning to go and glean? Niks nie. She was only concerned about food for her tummy and the mother-in-law's. But look what came out of it. A marriage, a child. And so the family of Elimelech lived on, because Boaz took on the responsibility. He loved the woman, he married her. And Ruth bore the son, as I've said, Obed, and Obed became the grandfather of David. And David was the ancestor of Jesus. So through that line, eventually the Messiah was born, the God who became flesh and lived among us. And that was God working behind the scenes. And did they understand all of this? No. They do now. And they look back and they see how God's hand was on their lives. As we do sometimes look back in our situations and we say, when we thought that God was not caring for us, He was busy. I said that Boaz did far more than was expected of him. Naomi received far more than she could ever have dreamed of. But Naomi too benefited from Boaz's extraordinary kindness. She had left Moab an embittered woman. But now she also experiences God's grace and God's blessing. And through God's grace and Ruth's love and her commitment and faithfulness, And the kindness of Boaz, Naomi's bitterness turns into gratitude. Naomi's unbelief turns into faith again. Naomi's sorrow turns into joy. And Naomi's despair turns into hope. And that's our God. Our God. And she became the proud grandmother. When she's sitting there, I'm sure that when people said, in South African terms, ach, shame. In the rest of the world, they say, what's wrong with the child? That people say, ach, shame. But here it means something else. And as she's sitting there rocking her grandchild, and they say, oh, what wonderful, what is the story? Yeah, this is Ruth's child, Obed. Who did Ruth marry? Oh, Boaz. Oh, how did that happen? Yeah, we went to Moab because... And so the glory gets given to God. Granny Naomi takes her grandson into her arms and thankfully cares for him. We know, because we've read our Bibles and we know a little more than just what happened here, that Boaz is a reflection of God. He's an image bearer of God's love and grace. And I want to apply it to us as people, but especially to us as a church. He's an image bearer of God's love and grace, as we, as individuals, but as the church should be too. Boaz is an example of the father heart of God, as we should be to others, and as we as a church should be to all who enter here. He lets us see that God watches over us and protects us and cares for us. We need to know that for ourselves, but we as a church should let people know that God watches over and protects and cares for us. Boaz lets us see that God is gracious, as we, the church, should be. Boaz, in the terms of what Jesus said that we are, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Boaz was a salt of the earth and a light of the world person. He made a difference. Salt makes a difference. He brought hope by being a light of hope, as we, the church, should be as well. Boaz, he was a witness of Jesus Christ, and he didn't even know Jesus. Jesus was still to come. God was still to become man here on earth, to die on the cross. But if we look back, we can say that Boaz was a witness of Jesus, because Boaz was a type of Christ. He was the forerunner of Jesus, who is the kinsman redeemer, who took our place, so that we could be restored into the family. A witness of Jesus Christ, just as we as individuals, but we as a church should be as well. He was a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, as I said. And he points us to the true kinsman redeemer. Just as we should be pointing to Jesus, the true kinsman redeemer, the true Savior, the true Lord. And we as a church should be doing that as well. That's why we are here as a church, to point people to Jesus Christ. As I said, to me, Boaz is also a picture of what the church should be like. Kind, friendly, welcoming, warm. We as a church should be like Boaz, creating an environment where people feel safe and secure, where people feel the worth that God sees in them by the way we value them and see them. That we are a generous people, that we look for how we can care for those who God brings across our path. How we can create circumstances whereby they have a safe work and living environment, where their interests are on our heart instead of our own. How can we use these people? How can we control these people? Instead of saying, as we should, how can we serve God by reaching out to these people? Boaz is a picture of what the church should be like, in my thinking also here in wanting people to experience God's love, God's grace, God's kindness, God's goodness, God's forgiveness, God's restoring and healing power, and God's desire to bless. That's what people should experience when they come to our home groups. That's what people should experience when they meet us personally and we get to know them. They sense something of the God whom we belong to. Perhaps you're feeling like Naomi. You're disappointed. She lost her husband, she lost her sons, and there were no grandchildren. Disappointed in yourself, disappointed in others, perhaps even disappointed in God. Perhaps like Naomi, you're bitter. You're bitter. Things haven't gone the way that you thought they should have gone. And as an individual, you've got more control over that. But if you're in a family, you've got less control. And if you're in a church like this, you have even less control. So you've become angry and bitter, hopeless, and perhaps even embarrassed to come back to Bethlehem where people will recognize you and you say, no, don't call me that anymore. I'm too embarrassed. I'm too embarrassed by the choices I made to go with my husband originally to Moab. But on the other hand, you may feel like Ruth. And let me say that Naomi, the feeling that Naomi had could also apply to men here this morning. And Ruth is a woman, but men also could feel like Ruth, who came because she's been uprooted. And alles is anders. She come into a different culture. You've got to learn new names. You've got to learn new habits. You've got to learn new patterns. You've got to learn the meaning of words. I learned a new word yesterday. Zamazamas. I didn't know what that word was. But Maria said to me, wil jy zamazama met my word? So I don't know what we're going to do together, but no, he didn't say that. But I never heard that word before. So we learn new words, new patterns. You become a Christian and you start singing. You've never sung before. But God is at work. That's how Naomi felt, lonely and vulnerable. And perhaps you're feeling like this morning. Heard wonderful testimonies yesterday morning in the time here, how God is at work. But I know that you're a church in transition, and I can understand that at times people feel like Ruth, uprooted. Alles wordt anders. I don't think alles wordt anders, but sometimes it feels like it in our lives. They're shaking. We've had shakings in our lives, where it feels like you're on an earthquake taking place. There, a sinkgat gaan plaatsvind. So it feels sometimes. And maybe you're like Ruth. And I want to say to you, know that God sees you. He sees you in your wilderness. He sees you in the brokenness you feel in your life, in your marriage, in your business. He sees you in your loneliness. And God doesn't say, well, take care of yourself. God doesn't say, don't bother me with those trivial things. I've got bigger things to care for. No, God comes like Boaz, because God is the true Boaz. And He's nearer than you dare to believe. And you may feel yourself insignificant and say, does God really care? Yes, He does. Boaz saw Ruth among all the workers there and the other people gleaning like Ruth. But he saw Ruth. Seek your refuge under the wings of the true Boaz. Take that step of faith and walk towards Him. And trust Him, God, the true Boaz, and allow Him to lead you and to guide you. So Naomi, Ruth, look up. Look to the true Boaz. And now I want to say, so I said there may be Naomi's and there may be Ruth's. But now I want to say to each of you, take care of the Ruths that come your way, and be a blessing to the Naomis, and point them to the true Boaz. Look out for the Naomis. Ask God, show us who the Naomis are. Show us who the Ruths are. And Lord, when you bring them across our path, we will trust you to help us to let them see the true Boaz. And I close with this. Paul writes to the Galatians, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. And you may say for 40 years, because I believe that's how old this church is, for 40 years we've been doing it and we see little fruit. But don't give up. For at the proper time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good. Let us show God's grace. Let us show God's kindness like Boaz to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So even if you're a Naomi this morning, or you're a Ruth, trust God to help you to become a Boaz. With God, it's never too late to start over again. They came back to Bethlehem at the beginning of a new season. And no matter what your past has been, and no matter how you've botched it up, and no matter how much you've gossiped, and how much you've slandered, and how much you've lived among the pigs like the younger lost son, come back to the bread of basket, Bethlehem. And allow God to help you make that new start, as He did in Naomi's life and Ruth's life. Are you trusting God for a new beginning in your situation? And don't clamp onto the past, when we and how nice it used to be. But even as a church, are you trusting God for a new beginning in that which He has ahead of you? To be a blessing like Boaz was, and to be a Boaz church here in Sabi. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I don't know the people here, so I can't say every one of us knows you to be the true Boaz. But for all of us here who have accepted Jesus as our Savior, who have embraced what you, Jesus, did on the cross of Calvary, and who've said that we want to follow you, we experience more and more how good you are and how kind and gracious. And yes, there are periods in our life that we sometimes even question, God, do you care? And sometimes we feel like you are far away. And we have our doubts. And sometimes we, like Naomi, have also become angry, disappointed, and bitter. But by trusting you, we've come through those times. Sometimes, like Ruth, we've felt uprooted. We've felt, is there any hope? But those of us who've walked with you for a longer time know that also that has passed. And you've brought a situation of defeat, you've changed into a situation of victory. And so I pray for every Naomi here this morning, for every Ruth. And I don't want to make light of what they may be experiencing and the pain they're feeling. And I pray that you will help them to put their trust in you and to come and hide under the wings of the eternal God. And as they do that, Lord, will you also do a work in each of our hearts, helping us to become more and more a Boaz. Because we know the true Boaz, and we want to be his representatives here on earth. And I pray that you will help this church through this time of transition and change, thanking you for all the new opportunities that the change brings about. Thanking you at the same time for all those who paid a price and contributed to where the church is now. But now as it makes a new beginning, that they may see new life. And that, Lord, it may be a bread basket where people can come and be fed with the true bread of life, Jesus Christ. And so I pray your blessing on this church and all these people, every individual, every married couple, those that are in pain through divorce or whatever else. Help us, Lord, to look to Jesus, our true kinsman redeemer, our true Boaz, as we praise your name. Amen.